Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My topic of discussion is clinical trials, and I will try to keep it as simple as possible. So first question I'm actually going to ask to you guys is, what do you understand by clinical trial in general? Anyone? Okay. And that's okay, because it's a difficult topic. A lot of people are unaware of what clinical trials are. With show of hands, do you think clinical trial is best to be done when all options are finished, or we should do it in early phases of treatment? Who thinks we should do it early phases? Okay, 1 person, 2 person. What about 3? Excellent, excellent. And then what about as the last resort? Okay, good. So I'll try to answer some of these questions in my talk today. So what are clinical trials? These are actually research studies. So these are human research studies which follow a very strict scientific standards. It tries to answer a question that whether a medical device, a medical treatment, or a strategy is beneficial or not in humans. It follows strict scientific standards. It asks a question. It tries to prevent any bias introduced in that question and tries to answer that after following a very systematic approach. It comes as a final stage of a research process. That process starts in the lab where, let's talk about cancer, where a scientist discovers a pathway or some kind of a vulnerability in tumor, studies that in cells derived from cancer, finds it very promising, goes to the next step, takes it to the animal, finds that it works really well in animals, the treatment. Now the next question is, should we try it in humans? What are the steps? Should we just randomly start giving this medication to everyone? So clinical trials play a role in that setting. They are designed to find whether any intervention, device, or strategy is safe, effective, and overall improves people's life, quality of life, and make them live longer. And I'm mainly focusing more on cancer, although the same principles apply for other diseases like heart disease, kidney disease, and other scientific research. A clinical trial may find that it improves patient outcome. It does not make any benefit at all, or unexpectedly, it can cause harm. An example of that would be hormone replacement therapy, which was given to women after they have been through menopause to see if this is going to be a beneficial treatment for symptoms, mainly to prevent heart disease. And eventually it found that it increased risk of stroke. So even though small studies showed that it was beneficial, when you actually tested it in human beings, you found that it was potentially harmful. So it answers all these questions. Now, today where we stand in gastric cancer management, we basically stand on the shoulders of all the people that have participated in the clinical trials and allowed us to answer whether D1 resection was better than D2 resection, whether radiation therapy given after treatment was beneficial than no radiation therapy. Chemotherapy, 2 chemotherapies were better than 3. So all these questions were very relevant questions. So where we stand right now, it's because other people have participated in clinical trials. Again, it's a key research tool for advancing medical knowledge and patient care. An important thing to consider is that clinical research is only done if physician or the research team is not sure of the answer. There's no point doing a clinical trial if you already know something is better. The most important thing would be such an approach, whether it will work well in people and is it safe. and which treatment or strategy will work best for certain illness or group of people. So those are the main aims. This is the slide that I took from NIH website. They have certain education material for physicians, so they can educate patients and caregivers. So 80% of clinical research in US struggles with the need to find participants. That's almost 4 in 5 studies. 1 in 5 clinical trial has to be closed because there's not enough people who participate in clinical studies. Obviously, groundbreaking medical advances will only happen through clinical research participation, and every scientific organization like NCCN, NIH, they all recommend clinical trial participation as a very important part of cancer care. Also, it is important that people, when physicians and research team talk to their patients about clinical trial, it helps. If I have 100 patients, 30% approximately would be willing to participate in clinical trials. To begin with, they are the ones who are more motivated. They are the kind of people who actually sit in these, discussions, who come to these meetings. Approximately the same percentage of people would consider it, but will have some reservations about clinical trials. And that's where the role of physician research team comes in, to make sure the patients and caregiver understand what's the reason behind clinical trial, how it's going to be helpful, and how they will be protected in that process. So let's go through different phases of clinical trial. We talked about studies being done on cancer cells grown in Petri dish, cancer grown in mice, and then when a medication is, have been through that process of almost 4, 5, 6, 7 years of research, preclinical, when it's ready to be checked or tested in clinical trials, what are the different phases that are currently available that we use to, one, make sure it's safe and effective. So the phase 1 clinical trial, the first one is mainly to test the safest dose of any treatment and to identify any unexpected side effect, because it's being tested for the first time in human beings. So the main goal of the phase 1 trial is not to identify any efficacy of that treatment, rather to make sure it's safe. So patients go through they start off at a very small dose, and then if that's safe, they go to the next level, next dose level, then to the next dose level. Eventually, you reach a point where you start noticing side effects in a slightly larger proportion of patients, and then you decide, okay, this is the dose that we are going to use for the next phase of study. So the phase 2 clinical trial comes after that. Majority of clinical trials in US are phase 2 clinical trials. It tries to determine how well treatment works. Plus, obviously, you have more patients, so you can see safety as well. For the phase 1 studies, usually you have around 10 to 30 patients. For phase 2 study, you may have between 30 to generally less than 100 patients. Phase 3 clinical trials basically are the next step after phase 2. Once we have proven that the treatment is safe to be given in human beings, we have shown that it has some efficacy, some effectiveness for a certain disease or a certain group, then phase 3 trials are used. They are the pivotal trials. They are the ones that help us determine if this is a better treatment or not than the current standard of care. So it confirms how well the treatment works. Obviously, you have more patients, so you can see more side effects, And then usually you have a comparison arm in this group. So the comparison arm is generally the standard of care treatment. So patients, who let's take an example of gastric cancer. After they've been through certain treatments, immunotherapy versus or different kind of the standard of care treatment, Taxotere versus immunotherapy, that will be a trial which will test a new treatment with the current standard of care. Phase 4 trials usually take place after FDA has approved, in US, after FDA has approved the medication. We know that it works. Now, when you use that medication in common practice, what kind of unexpected side effect that physicians are noticing in community? Not just in big referral centers, but also when this medication has been given to patients in rural New Mexico somewhere, where I practiced for a long time. What kind of side effects that people are noticing? And also you will have a diverse population, not just a very screened population that you usually get in clinical trials. For a clinical trial, it has to follow, since it's a scientific study, there has to be a protocol. The questions that need to be answered in that protocol are, how many patients will take part in the clinical trial? Who is eligible for this trial? What test patient will have to undergo, either as part of standard of care or extra tests that need to be done, such as a biopsy that they have to undertake to help us see if the treatment is working, if it's going into the tissues where it's supposed to go. So those kind of scientific questions can be answered, and some patients who are participating in it may have to undergo extra procedures. So each trial has their own set guidelines. What type of data will be collected? How many times a person will be seen? And obviously there should be a detailed information about the treatment plan, which should be uniform throughout. An important part of the clinical trial protocol is in the inclusion criteria. So inclusion is age. What kind of stage? Should be a stage 1. Could be a preventative strategy. Could this be a stage 4 patients that have been through 2 lines of treatment? So you have to determine what are we targeting. Should they have any, it's okay to have kidney problem or not, or liver problem or not. So those kind of questions. Usually they're very strict. They want a person who is very healthy. Exclusion criteria, whether a person has some kind of heart issue, heart abnormality, kidney abnormality. Usually those patients are not, but each trial sets its own standards. How do we decrease bias? So as I mentioned, it's a scientific study, so you want to decrease the bias through having a comparison arm. Usually it's done for phase 3 and higher studies. You compare the new treatment or intervention with the standard of care. It could be placebo. So usually we don't use placebo in cancer patients. Only when we use placebo is generally you have a standard of care treatment and you add an intervention on top of it. And in the second arm, you get a standard of care treatment plus a medication, a placebo medication. So you still get some kind of treatment. We don't just let people say, you're not going to get any treatment at all. Randomization. So randomization is basically a way to remove bias from these studies. You want to make sure that every person has an equal chance into balancing out into each group. You don't want the unhealthy people to not receive a new treatment. So it prevents bias introduced by investigators. Same thing with blinding. Then a patient, physician, investigator do not know what kind of treatment a person. This is called blinding. These are all to decrease the bias in the study. So when we get the results, it's valid, it's reliable, it is reproducible. The research team member will include a principal investigator, which will supervise all aspects of the clinical trial. A research nurse, a data manager, colleagues of the principal investigator, staff physicians who are seeing patients in the clinic, or the nurse. And other members too. This is just a very short list. What do we expect in clinical trials? We expect very close monitoring of patient's health, a participant's health. Multiple healthcare providers participate in your care. You will usually see a nurse, a research nurse, a physician. You're seen at regular intervals. So whenever my patients have participated in clinical trial, I've seen that their care actually improves a lot. Why? Because they're being monitored so closely. You monitor their heart health, you monitor their kidney function, liver function. So they're very well protected. Some patients may need to travel or stay in the hospital, for different clinical trials. So you have to keep logistic in mind as well. A lot of time, a logbook is asked to be maintained by the patient. So where you say, okay, I've taken this medication or not. So some responsibility on the patient behalf as well. And then some trials may ask you to fill out certain forms about how you feel, about your quality of life, that are extremely important in cancer care anyways. Benefit for patients: you are able to gain access to new treatments. By the time a medication reaches, phase 2, phase 3 studies, there's some obviously preclinical data behind it. So patient is able to gain access to that treatment much sooner. And if it is beneficial, then you're able to receive it way ahead of what you would have been otherwise able to receive it. You are very closely monitored for all the organ functions. The information that is gathered, whether the treatment is helpful, not helpful, or even I'll say harmful, will help add to scientific knowledge and will help the rest of the community and humanity. The benefits or risk of a treatment can be identified earlier because you don't just give the medication to the whole patient population. You select a population, you test, you watch them. So you're able to find, is this beneficial? If there are unexpected side effects, that we should terminate this trial. So you're able to find both the benefit and risk early, and they would be used as compared to when they're used in the general medical practice. What are the risks? As I mentioned, the new strategies and treatment aren't always better. They may not work. Side effect or risk, are unknown at that moment. But we make sure that, patients are generally healthier, and then they are watched very closely. Another issue would be, health insurance-wise. Some health insurance may or may not cover it. Although, cost-wise, this is something that should be addressed upfront early on to see if the insurance covers clinical trial or not. The most important thing, I think, is protection of participants. So there's scientific oversight that is obligated. There's institutional review boards which constitute not only physicians, but other, like a chaplain, patient advocate, non-scientific people who review the whole clinical protocol and see, is this ethical or not, before it is even begun. Once the trial begins, there is data safety monitoring board, usually when we talk about phase 3 and phase 3 trials, which will review the data periodically to assess, are there any safety problems, or are there any differences in result? If they find that the intervention is much, much better, they might even recommend closing the trial early and giving it to all the, open it for all the patients. Also, they can even terminate the trial if they think the side effect is too harmful. FDA also provides oversight of the trial. They want to make sure they help design the trial as well. They will also make sure that the institutions that are providing the clinical trial, They are following the protocol. And this is one of the, I think, most important safeguard that provides protection to the participants of the clinical trial. And then there's Office of Human Research Protection as well in each institute. So for a patient, what is more important? So the first and foremost important thing is informed consent. The question that you should ask, what is the purpose of this study? Who is sponsoring it? What kind of medication interventions are involved? What are possible risks, side effects? Is it going to affect my daily life? How long the trial will last? Who's going to pay for the tests and treatment I received? Will I be reimbursed for other expenses? These are very important questions. And I actually, picked this slide up from one of the websites that provide information about clinical trials, because but informed consent is a two-way process. It's not just a physician or a nursing team just giving you information, but you asking the right questions and understanding what you're going into. Participants can withdraw from the study at any time for any reasons. Obviously, patients have right to learn about new risks or findings that are coming from the trial. If the trial medication is showing more harmful effect, then even the team may decide that the patient will not continue on the treatment. So let's take an example. If a person is having too many side effects on the trial medication, you decrease the dose, but the side effects continue, even though the patient may desire to stay on the trial, but our obligation to first cause no harm may require us to remove the patient from the trial. These are the websites which I found very helpful. These are also the website where you can go and look at certain clinical trials that are available in US. Okay. I'll be happy to answer any questions.